Thanks very much, and it's a great honour to be in Lund. If I speak too quickly or too quietly, wave your hand and stop me. I get excited and passionate, particularly about this subject. And so I'll be talking kind of around this idea of aural diversity. We don't know how to say it actually. I mean, because aural is a strange word in English because we have O-R-A-L and A-U-R-A-L, which are actually pronounced the same. There's no, but we've ended up calling this aural instead of oral. So I should have come up with a better word that was clearer. But anyway, not to be confused with oral, like when you go to the dentist. But aural.
Aural, sorry.
Like that. Well, no, we don't know how to say it. I mean, it's some strange English issue. But anyway, well, I'll be talking around this subject. But in some sense, you probably already, I think the term is probably enough already. You probably already get what it is, and you get what I'm going to be talking about. It's pretty obvious, I think. And I'll be in the talk. I'll kind of cover different areas, including kind of sound arts and kind of old school acoustics. And hopefully it will be kind of useful. And I'll be very interested to hear kind of your perspective and your take on these ideas. So yeah, and I should say my background was originally as I did a music degree, but I was a rather kind of strange teenager, so I did kind of go from Edinburgh to Glasgow to see John Cage when I was about 16 years old, and I thought that was important, although I found John Cage kind of grumpy, not very pleasant old man, but I was absorbed in avant-garde music as a kid, and I moved from that into kind of electroacoustic music, sonic art, towards soundscape work. So I've been involved in acoustic ecology since the kind of late 90s. And then more recently, as Sana was referencing, I then did a diploma in acoustics about 8 years ago now, because I realized I really needed to understand acoustics more than purely having this kind of composery, art humanities background, but it was really important to have a proper grip on how acoustics works to be able to move my kind of practice and my understanding. So the slide says listening. So people like me, I don't know if I've changed now, but I used to be super evangelical about sound in a kind of Murray Schafer kind of way that sounds amazing. It's such an exciting sense, and I need to go and tell people about it and get people excited and get people listening and having this great dialogue and exploration of the sonic environment. And I know I'm still there, but I'm kind of expanding that a bit. And in that field of kind of sound studies, we talk about listening and sonic art. We talk about listening a lot, but we don't talk much about hearing. And so this talk, I want to kind of bring hearing back in again. But when I mean hearing, I mean the way that a hearing professional, like when you get your hearing test done, or you go to an audiologist, that kind of person, the way they talk about hearing. Not hearing as, I mean, often it's characterized, you have listening and hearing as if hearing is kind of passive listening. I don't mean that at all. I mean kind of hearing as in the sense of hearing. But commonly in our field, we talk about listening a lot, and there's lots of professionals in our world, of academics, who've got all these kind of wonderful modes of listening. Here's a nice list of them. I don't need to go through them. You'll know some of them, or maybe all of them. It's like everyone's coining a new kind of listening to help us kind of unpack what listening is. And there's many, many more. And I think I've also tried to coin some different kinds of listening as well. And it's useful and it's helpful. And of course, we've got Jonathan Stern at the end there, who's kind of critiquing all of this stuff as well. And we could go through that. But these are kind of different kinds of listening. Labelle's there as well, relational listening. And we kind of learn about hearing that, here's a list of words which are all nice. These are the things that kind of the sense of hearing offers us. Discern, differentiate, decompose, break it up. Locate, orientate, liaise, connect, bridge, embody, immerse, relate. For hearing, we can be traveled or transported. Fascinated or transfixed, transcend. It's something very Wagnerian now. Euphoria, tingle. I mean, we're now in the world of the obsession of ASMR. There was a very interesting exhibition in London recently at the Design Museum on ASMR. And if you went to this exhibition, you were promised to have that kind of this tingling feeling. That's something that seems to be available to us all, which I would question. We're going to talk about that later. Exalted rapture, yeah, that's what Wagner believes, through his music you could do. And it's all, something that, this is all the wonderful things that kind of hearing can do. We'll kind of come back, I'll kind of later on, I'll present a slightly kind of different list around hearing. Okay, so just kind of setting up, kind of thinking about listening and hearing. So a little bit of a kind of history project. I discovered a record. So I used to collect sound effects records, particularly from the 1930s when they were first making sound effects. And they're like sound effects for, I don't know why they were making them, for like amateur dramatic performances. So they could have sounds of a horse whinnying or a baby crying. Some of these sound effects records are terribly bad as well. And I remember there's one that has all these kind of animal sound effects, and it's clearly a man who's making the sound of donkeys. And I used to think, this is rubbish. How could anyone even use this? Why wouldn't you just have a man at the side making, or a woman be making the donkey sound? And actually, I found a book about sound effects from the 1930s, and they actually refer to that particular disc saying it's particularly bad. So there you go. But sound effects records they're a kind of weird phenomenon because well, sound effects are a strange thing because they're not the same as field recordings or soundscapes. Sound effects are this kind of shorthand, sound design kind of thing that refers to something happening rather than being a recording of it. But often within sound effects records in the early days, you've got field recordings, which never quite work very well as sound effects, but they're really interesting and they're kind of quite noisy. Anyway, in the mix of that, Columbia was one of the record companies that produced a lot of sound effects records. I've got boxes and boxes of these. I'm sure one day my partner's going to throw these out. She's been threatening, but they're lovely things. And here's a very special one. So Columbia, right? It's on that side. It says London Street Noises, Leicester Square. On the other side, it's got Beecham Place, and it says recorded in conjunction with the Daily Mail, which is people who know Britain will know that Daily Mail is a very specific newspaper. One that Anyway, it's a very populist newspaper. It's huge. The Daily Mail it's got a very, very, very wide readership, huge readership. Anyway, careful what I say. It's like explanations by Commander Daniel after that, which is really, who is this Commander Daniel? And what's great on the recording is that you actually, on both sides, you hear Commander Daniel talking, and he accounts the exact time and date of the recording. And this is in 1928, and on the 80th anniversary in 2008, I went back to one of the locations at exactly the same date and time. I went to Beecham Place. Some of my PhD students went to Leicester Square and recorded on exactly the 80th anniversary. I thought there'd be lots of people doing the same thing, but there wasn't anyone. But I thought this is an obvious thing to do, and so we did those recordings and kind of forgot about them. Thought it was interesting. Then it was the 90th anniversary in 2018. I was going to say 28, but I haven't got there yet. That's the 100th anniversary. That's coming up. And I did a bit more research this time, thinking about, well, what is this? Where did this come from? What was the point of it? And I went into the Daily Mail archive, as you do, for my sins. And it turns out to be a huge campaign about traffic noise. Now, I kind of talk about it in this context of aural diversity because their understanding of hearing is very, very different to how the 20th century has really kind of pushed hearing and noise issues. So the decibel, which I'll talk about later, isn't being used yet to measure loudness or noise or loudness. That doesn't. It's been kind of worked out, but it hasn't been applied yet. So what they were doing was using field recording as a way of documenting noise in an effort to communicate that to the government to make change about environmental noise. So that's kind of really interesting. So it's kind of field recording was doing its job there. Now the agenda, throughout most of the 20th century, most of our legislation in the UK is around noise, is about hearing damage. So health in the UK, we've got health and safety at work. And if you're exposed to a particular sound levels over 80 decibels or 85 A-weighted decibels, and we'll talk about A-weighted decibels later, then, and you're exposed to so many hours, then your employer needs to kind of take action and give you ear muffs and so on, and you're in danger of damaging your hearing. And that approach to the danger of noise and loudness on your hearing has been a kind of big kind of thrust of noise abatement in the UK anyway. It's all about damaging your hearing. This is from another era when it's not about that. It's actually about, well, it starts off with this article by this guy, Sir Percival Phillips, who's looking at the effect of this. There's actually an economic issue here that we're not being as productive as we are due to the impairment of the workforce. And he actually has the sum of £1 million a week due to noise. It's affecting people's sleeping, and it's affecting people's nerves. We have this neurasthenia, kind of James Mansell talks about it, the neurasthenia, because this is after the First World War. There's an understanding of kind of shell shock. Actually, and in the articles they talk about the kind of shell shock of the noise of the streets. So it's a very different era of thinking about the kind of dangers of noise, the effects on your nerves. And there's all these wonderful articles here. And I mean, I found hundreds of them around this time. And it goes into much more detail. So here we have, I've actually found pictures of the recording equipment, the locations. Here we've got the Home Secretary listening to the recordings. And actually, as a result of these sound recordings, they actually introduce, for example, this kind of zones of silence. So at the time, there was no legislation around the use of hooters, car hooters. They're probably quite cute in those, because that old-fashioned, kind of, I can't the sound, that kind of cute hooter sound rather than an electric one, I think. But of course, traffic noise, some of the roads have got actual wooden, are wooden, or they're very rough, and you've got wooden, pneumatic wheels are just beginning to appear. There's silencers exist but aren't being used very well on things like motorbikes. You've got cobbled roads as well. There's no legislation about maintenance of cars, but the cars are becoming very big at this stage. So it's a very environmental noise is very, I mean, traffic noise really. That's what it's about. It's very loud, and it's causing a big problem. And yeah, I won't talk about this too long, but it's been a kind of fascinating project. And what happened was, as I did more research, I realised that there was more recordings. It wasn't just Leicester Square and Beecham Place. We found a box within what's called the Museum of London. And this box is amazing because it has a letter from the editor of the Daily Mail saying, please look after this box, we think it might be important. We open it up and it's this dust coming out. And it was extraordinary. And the Museum of London let us, Goldsmiths, digitise the recordings. And it's fascinating. There turns out to be a whole load of locations which were recorded at this stage, including, for example, St George's Hospital, which is gone now. That's been moved, but that's kind of a Hyde Park Corner kind of area, if you know London. And they chose that location because it's a hospital location, and they were concerned of the traffic noise of people in the hospital at this stage in 1928. Amazingly, they also refer to people in hospital who were able to listen to the proms in the Albert Hall via some kind of amazing kind of headphone system in 1928, but they couldn't hear it because of the traffic noise. So it's fascinating kind of technologies of the day. The technology is quite interesting. This is September 1928. This is you've got things like around a couple of months at the same time, you've got, for example, the first broadcast of the Jazz Singer happening. So you've got the first talkies, happening around this time. So the technology is just available. But the sound recording technology is really, really complex. They actually had to, you find people have, two people, I found actually someone in the old British Sound Archive referenced these recordings because they were aware of them, and I think I'd digitized them earlier, but I hadn't thought much about them. But they theorized that, and if they're wrong, they thought there was a recording van. And they had some idea about how they recorded it, but what they hadn't done is actually look at the Daily Mail. And it's all in the Daily Mail, you just need to read it about how they recorded them. They actually, in each location, they actually had to install these huge rooms full of equipment, including these ovens to heat up the discs to a specific temperature. And of course, the recordings are about 3 minutes long. And you've got the voice as well of Commander Daniels speaking. Very, very complex, a huge affair. Here's me over 10 years apart. He's getting balder. There I'm looking very happy with the fluffy microphone on the left, because I actually figured out exactly the location of one of the recordings in Beecham Place, which was great. And it was quite interesting once we started doing recording in the street on the 90th anniversary. Also on the 90th anniversary, it was the same day of the week, which is kind of a bit more significant than the original recording. And so we did different kinds of recording techniques and ambisonic stuff and binaural and so on. Not quite sure exactly how best to do it. Just trying out different kind of techniques. And as we stood there in the streets kind of recording stuff, of course people wanted to talk to us and find out what we're doing, you know. And it's great. I could show photographs of the people of the kind of street back in 1928 where the mics were. And there was these women who came out from a diamond shop. Because Beecham Place is a slightly strange location. It's just around from Harrods. And you've got Pond Street just further down there where the Scottish Church is heading towards Sloane Square. So this is a highly, highly exclusive area now. Well, it probably always was, of London. And the women from the diamond shop came out, and I think they lived above the diamond shop. And once I talked to them about what we were doing, and they were interested in the history of traffic noise, and they were like, "Oh, we need to talk to you." And they got very animated, because a contemporary issue, I don't know how it is now, but this, going back definitely in 2018, what you had was at night time, you had men from the Middle East who have diplomatic passports who'd shipped over their racing cars, their Ferraris and whatever it was, their Lamborghinis, which are somehow exempt of any, because they've got the diplomatic passes, are exempt of any kind of legislation, race around that part of London at night time. So it was very interesting, because the discussion about noise suddenly became very kind of racialized and quite complex about these people who are allowed to do this at night time. But it's kind of contemporary noise subject. I could go on about this, but it's interesting. And we've got a nice website where you can hear the recordings. They're fascinating. And Commander Daniels is a pioneer of sound recording. You should check him out. I could tell you, I could do a whole lecture on the history of Commander Daniels, but I won't bore you. But he was a Navy commander anyway, who'd picked up this project after leaving the Navy, after being actually court-martialed from the Navy. But that's another story. And then this happened. We had COVID-19, have you heard of that? So that happened in the UK. It happened. Huh?
Was that a local thing?
Yes, I blame the Tory party. So yeah, it's all over now. It's all history. So student joke, should I? It was horrible. But as we know, it was a kind of strange. It was, for many of us, it was a kind of strange listening experiment, a kind of strange soundscape experiment. And I kind of took the opportunity towards the end to go back to those locations again, to capture those moments when there was no traffic. And in Leicester Square, there was pigeons. The pigeons are still there, feeling a bit lost. But those recordings now become kind of important historical documents. And as you look at these things, look at this. Here's Virginia Woolf, the 26th of October, 1928. So like a few days later, she's listening to central London as well. And this is referenced in a Room of One's Own, which if you haven't read, you need to go and read it urgently, especially if you're a man. But, wonderful bit of writing. But she does a kind of listening exercise in London. In fact, it turns out in Bloomsbury it was actually very quiet. She's surprised how quiet it is. So it's quite interesting. Of course, there's another documentation, before, along with recorded sound. We've got, people's diaries, and of course we've got wonderful diaries now, especially in thinking about the kind of aural diversity thing. I mean, I've been reading, for example, Kafka's letters, which have, Kafka was someone who had very sensitive hearing, who was obsessed with traffic noise, obsessed with his father-in-law's voice, and when his father-in-law cleared his throat, he just made Kafka go crazy. Or we've got Marcel Proust's letters now, writing to his neighbour, the most polite letters ever, asking them, I'm going to be doing some writing in a couple of days' time, can you please be quiet, kind of thing, but done in this Proustian kind of way. So it's kind of interesting. We have that kind of another kind of archive there to learn about people's attitudes to sound and noise. And with the London Street Noises Project, that's kind of what it's about as well. It's not just about, as we kind of carry it on, it's not just about what sounds are there and why are they there and the legislation and what does it tell us, but it's also, I'm really interested in the attitudes how are our attitudes changing to noise and kind of soundscapes, particularly as soundscape becomes a much more of a kind of recognized concept. So there's a little kind of historical thing, kind of pre-decibels. Now here's my kind of my hand dryer project, which San has already referenced. And I've kind of, I like to think I've kind of moved on from hand dryers. I don't think I will be until they're completely banned. But I heard in Finland they were, during COVID, they got, is that right? They got, any Finnish bit, they got turned off in Finland because people believed they were not great for COVID. I don't want to get sued, but I'm guessing that hand dryers aren't great for bacteria anyway, because and viruses, because I think all they do is, well, high-speed hand dryers. And I'm not talking about the warm air dryer that evaporates moisture in your hands, but the fast air dryer that strips moisture off your hands. I mean, all they're doing is stripping tiny little particles of vapor into the air at hundreds of miles an hour, which you then inhale. I mean, isn't that all they do? Am I wrong? Am I missing something? So I know this, you're recording this. I'm not putting that on record. I'm just questioning that. I mean, they're not killing the bacteria or viruses, are they? I mean, how would they do that? All it's doing is blowing them around. Anyway, just a thought. But that's not my specialism. I know nothing. But I have studied the sound levels of hand dryers. And again, going back to the kind of aural diversity kind of concept, and without sounding too cheesy, I became a dad and had these little children, bringing them up in London, which is a noisy city, and I was always kind of very suddenly aware of their hearing and how their hearing is really different from mine, and I've got very, very sensitive hearing, and it was always my job to take the kids I was the one who always, when we were out, to take them to the public toilet to change their nappies. That was always my job. I didn't mind doing it, I'm completely fine. For some reason I'm immune to their smell, I don't know. Other children's nappies is like, you know, this is weird. Other kids' nappies is like horrendous. My own kids' nappies are completely fine. That's kind of olfactory diversity or something. Anyway, the first time I experienced a high-speed hand dryer was in Disneyland, Hong Kong, I think, in 2007. And they had these Panasonic hand dryers. And my son was almost about 1 year old at that stage. And I took him in there to change his nappies. And there was a designated area in the men's toilet to change the nappies. And it's like that there. And then there was Panasonic hand dryers here and here. And these are a very early generation of high-speed hand dryers. And they were in constant use. And the sound levels were really, really extraordinary. And of course, at the same height as the child and the kind of ear level as the baby. And he was distraught. And of course he should be. I mean, he was really like inconsolable for a kind of long time. And that kind of began to get me thinking. And then I came across this picture in a kind of local toilet where we lived in South London. And it says kind of caution loud when in use, known to startle children. Someone stuck that on, you know, and scribbled it on. I won't play the recording, but this one's particularly horrible and particularly nasty. And at the time, so here's the list of the hand dryer names. This is out of date now, because this project's going back to really 2000, I don't know. Well, I started in 2008, but you know, but a good 10 years ago now, maybe more than that. And this is the branding of the hand dryers. So Airblade, Air Force, Air Fury, Jet Towel, Tornado, Typhoon, Accelerator. So in the names, there's already a suggestion of, I mean, Murray Schafer calls it kind of a sacred noise and sound power and all this kind of, the relationship between power and noise is a kind of big, ancient kind of concept. And it's in the names there. And actually one of the first talks I gave on this hand dryer stuff was in a conference on ambience and atmosphere in Munich, quite a long time ago now. And it was quite early in my research, and I was kind of very kind of like, oh, these hand dryers are too loud. And I had all these German guys saying, what are you talking about? We love high-speed hand dryers. We think they're fantastic. Dyson Airblades, fantastic. We love it. We feel that, you just feel it working so well, and we queue up to use it. It's just because you just know it works. It's just because it's so loud, you know it's working really, really well. And it's like, oh, okay. And it's like, anyway, feel equal power, you know. And I remember talking once to, thinking about the kind of hearing damage thing. I talked to someone who worked in a major London train station, which had a toilet full of Dyson Airblades, something like 30 Dyson Airblades, and they were on continuously. And I asked him, do you know, are you not worried about your hearing? And he said, listen, they're so ecological. Which is like, okay. Somehow you've been told that the louder they are, the more ecological they are, and that's great. You know, somehow that's what happened there. So it's been really odd. And this is the language that Dyson's used. You won't find this quote online anymore. This is not one of his Dyson colleagues. This is actually talking about one of the Dyson vacuum cleaners. And it's great here. They say, remember the fan rotates at 35,000 RPM. Schumacher's Ferrari does 19,000. So isn't that great? You know, it's faster. Your domestic product, this fan is moving way faster than a Formula One car. Isn't that cool? You know, so this is this kind of mentality of like, yeah, it's so loud, it's so fast, it's so powerful. It's an old kind of futurist, I don't know, trope. Yeah. So that's the kind of, that seems to be the kind of the mentality. It's changed now. I mean, I don't know what modern hand dryers are called around here, but in London you get things like the dolphin hand dryer. You know? So they have changed it. I think possibly because of some of my work, but I'd like to claim. So super loud, kind of ecological. I mean, the point is that and then you'll find lots and lots of claims. And I did quite a lot of research at the time. I'll look at all the papers that existed, and different companies were kind of, and there's a battle between the paper towels and the hand dryers, saying which was the more ecological. It was always funded by the companies, so the research was always a bit kind of funny to look at. It's also about speed as well. I actually got a very nice quote from a manager in a big business who really likes loud hand dryers because it stops his workforce hanging out in toilets chatting. So that's good. don't want that. Okay, I'll carry on a bit. I get obsessed. And yeah, this loudness thing, I mean, he's this lovely term, bellyphonic. You know this great book? It's really worth checking out by Doherty, who's listening to war, who talks to ex-soldiers, but also to people who live in Iraq. And he's got this nice term, and it's kind of a useful quote because, you know, I do come from a kind of sound art world and music world where we tend to do loud gigs, you know, and we like doing loud gigs. And I've done loud hand dryer gigs, to my shame. So the co-vibration of resonance can be a deep-seated source of joy and a visceral reminder of our fundamental interconnectedness. As choral singers, the world over know in their bones, but far less attention has been paid to its corollary. That acoustic interconnectedness increases our ability to be affected by others and by our environment in negative ways as well. Because of this fact, a full or exhaustive consideration of sound cannot be undertaken without a consideration of the potential for violation and violence that sound constantly affords. So it's that kind of violation or violence that really becomes the fore in the kind of hand dryer project. And I did proper acoustics. I managed to get hold of a Dyson Airblade early on. And we did the sound power test following the right regulations. Because we don't know how loud it is for a start. You know, I need to kind of know this product, you know, how loud is it? And when you buy a product like a hairdryer or a hand dryer or something that makes sounds, you normally, this is in the UK, but it's probably similar in Sweden, you normally get told this sound power number in possibly in decibels. And that's a number that gets quoted a lot on these products. Now, sound power is not the same thing as sound pressure. Sound power, we refer to the standards, actually refers to wattage. Sound pressure, when we talk about decibels, refers to pascals, which is a kind of human scale of threshold of audibility up to pain. So they're different. It's a different thing. They're related, but they shouldn't be confused. The sound power, obviously, also refers to having a hand dryer in this space, in the anechoic chamber, where there is no reflection. Toilets are the most reflective spaces we go to. They're acoustic catastrophe. They're a disaster. And in one example, I worked out that due to the reflection of this very small space that I was measuring the hand dryer in, and in the UK you squeeze, because of legislation you have to provide hand drying facilities if you provide a toilet. You don't have to provide a toilet, but if you do provide a toilet, you have to have hand drying facilities. And people will put hand dryers into the tiniest toilets in the UK, which are often strange locations, and you trigger them as you walk in. And all disabled toilets have high-speed hand dryers. Often people will trigger them as they walk in, and it's a big issue. But anyway, one big issue is the reflection. So it's an acoustic. It's not just about the product. It's an acoustical issue. And the example I was talking about there, I think I worked out it was equivalent, due to reflection, equivalent to having 19 hand dryers on at the same time due to reflection. Because it's just small shiny surfaces. It has to be. So so these are kind of interesting issues to think about. Those are my kids. I use the kids to do my research, which is a bit naughty, but I did kind of guerrilla acoustics. So I kind of took my levels from here. And of course, instead of having one number, instead of saying it's 85 decibel sound power, I would actually do it in third octave bands, which is what you normally do in acoustics, so you know where the energy lies across the spectrum. And I also did FFT analysis, so I've got a bigger sense of the spectrum of sound, and also did sound recordings as well, anechoic recordings. So I've got a much bigger sense of actually the sonic contents of these sounds, which is really useful. Because you need to, saying something is 80 decibels doesn't mean much. You don't know what it sounds like. You don't know if it's going to be high frequency, it's going to be rough or sharp or whatever. It's a very meaningless number. So then I went into kind of public toilets without asking anyone, make sure they're empty. Normally I have my kids with me to kind of make it seem like okay. And then we do things like pop balloons to measure reverberation time and record the hand dryers and do the acoustic study of the hand dryers anyway, following a standard. Well, you can't slightly have to make up a standard. There's no such standard, but do my best to do them as consistent as I could and repeatable as I could to measure the hand dryers. I include the kids' picture there because they're cute and they're not cute anymore. No, sorry, they're probably listening. They're all teenagers now. But you see my son there at the top there. He's really unhappy. My daughter there, she's smiling, right? And these are old-fashioned hand dryers, but the point is that she's smiling because she loves being terrified, okay? So it's a good reminder that, people, some kids love the like, oh, so she go to the hand dryer and she'd go, people love going on roller coasters because they're terrifying. Doesn't mean they're like, everyone should go on a roller coaster. It should be a matter of choice to go on a roller coaster. So you've got the people in the sensory, in some terms you got them like, you've got the kind of sensory avoidance people and the sensory, what's the opposite? People who are pulled towards sensory experience. So that's why I include them. It's nice to see them there. And let me read this quote because it kind of goes back to my kind of earlier list of things about hearing at the beginning. So, blah, 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 John Drever says something. Okay, I learned that it perturbed. So, from my study, this is what I learned. Through the sense of hearing, sound perturbs, isolates, excludes, disconnects, disembodies, and dislocates. It can precipitate emotions of fear, repulsion, nausea, embarrassment, shame, alienation, bereavement, stage fright, this is toilet stuff, flashback, threat, hallucination, disorientation, insecurity, exposure, vulnerability, dizziness, rage, and sensory shutdown. And it can cause severe pain. And in that sense, I'm referring to things like hyperacusis. I don't know if you've heard about hyperacusis. As I was doing the study, I began to learn about audiology and things I didn't know anything about. And to be honest, I felt a bit ashamed because I'd been someone who'd, immersed themselves in the kind of world of sound from a very early age in a very, very diverse way and really interested in sound, excited about it. And I was aware of people who are deaf and people like Evelyn Glennie, who's actually got a great paper around hearing, which is worth reading as a deaf person, a deaf percussionist, a virtuoso percussionist talking about hearing. It's a very important paper. But I never really thought, and I was also aware of people's kind of hearing, the dangers of sound on your hearing, but I hadn't come across most of the things I now kind of talk about. So, hyperacusis is when the pain threshold drops right down and the world is too loud. And And I'm someone who loves sound and obsessed with sound, and suddenly here's people who are also obsessed with sound, but they're obsessed with it because their lives are destroyed. Their lives are intolerable because the world's too loud. And I hadn't heard of this. And then these people started to find me and asking for help. And who else in this list? So I've got misophonia. You heard of misophonia? Do you know that term? So misophonia is the mouth, people who become very angry when they hear all kinds of sounds, but like mouth sounds particularly, eating crisps, snoring, that kind of thing. Misophonia is interesting because it's all associative. It's all associative sound. It's not about the sound levels per se, it's about the association of what's causing those sounds. It's like the evil brother to ASMR. And sometimes people who've got ASMR also have misophonia, and people might even have this in this room, it's very common, that some sounds might be wonderful to you and you'd like go towards them, other sounds might make you extremely angry. I think I had a bit of this when I was a teenage boy, and we had breakfast at this very small breakfast table, and when my dad ate his cornflakes, I used to get really angry for some reason. But maybe that's me being a teenager. But I remember like going, I couldn't stand the sound of my dad eating his cornflakes. Sorry, Dad. But anyway, phonophobia is a kind of very extreme sense of kind of fear of sound, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. How much do we know about that in relationship to sound, and how do we think about it? I mean, very little. We're obsessed with fireworks at Christmas time, but imagine I became friendly with a sound artist who was born and brought up in her first years of life in Sarajevo, and she was telling me, we don't celebrate with fireworks if you're from Sarajevo. It's like, okay, I can get that, I understand that. And then there's autism, which is like a huge, really become one of the main kind of issues here. Autism, because autism is a spectrum, so it's quite hard to kind of, that concept of aural diversity is a spectrum, but in some sense that's where they kind of echo each other a bit. And I particularly got a lot of data from someone who's got autism who helped me go into autistic discussion lists and get a discussion around hand dryer noise, and I got lots of kind of useful kind of feedback from people with autism. And they're also talking about flush sounds as well, because sometimes you get the high-speed flush thing, like a bit like a flush in an aircraft. You get that sometimes in public toilets as well. It can be very loud. But then you get people who are, the hypo and the hyper, so people who are actually drawn towards things like a hand dryer sound, that they can actually get obsessed with the hand dryer sound. And then there's interesting cases like, I don't know, it's not my slides here, is it? Well, it's at the bottom there, but this is a particular toilet issue, but I came across people who were using, it's my kind of final point there, this is a kind of list of particular subgroups who find hand dryer an issue, but people who've got basically shy bladder and shy bowel syndrome. So people who've got basically toilet issues, they were hunting out toilets which were very private, but they were liking hand dryer noise because it gives them some acoustic privacy. We know in Japan they've been doing this for hundreds of years, actually, it turns out. In Japanese women's toilets today, you've got little boxes that make kind of water sounds. But in the Edo period, when was that, 200 years ago, they had Japanese aristocratic ladies had these urns which made gurgling sounds to mask their toilet sounds. So there is an ancient history of it. I'm sure in Scandinavia it's completely different. Sorry, I've got memories of being in Finland as a kid at a big scout camp, and that was quite, in the wilderness, and that was definitely not the Japanese ladies' toilet, I'm sure. But anyway, but yeah, it's an issue. People were actually looking for the liking those sounds for the privacy that they afforded, although they were super loud. But so it's kind of interesting. So this list is quite important. So this list are the kind of, and I kind of was working from a list that already existed in the WHO's the study from 1999. The very good useful document from 1999 on community noise, and I kind of developed it a bit further, particularly looking at the people I'd heard of. But what you find is we're talking about all these all these human beings, pregnancy, fetuses, infants, children, and older people. I'm missing out the group in the middle there, the kind of that kind of I don't know youngish adults people, but everyone else has particular kind of hearing issues, medical problems, high blood pressure, blind people. People have taken their dogs to the toilet because they're blind. Hearing impaired people have got cochlear implants, post-traumatic. I got a list already: hyperacousia, misophonia, phonophobia, tinnitus. I've got tinnitus. I get it. My tinnitus gets triggered by hand dryer noise now. Cerebral palsy. I hadn't heard of that before. A boy in my daughter's class at school. He's quite immobile because of cerebral palsy. But he gets very stressed of hand dryer noise, so it's doubly, he can't get away. But there's this huge noise coming from the hand dryer. Dementia, kind of really, really important. This is basically most, in that list, we're all in that list, so that's important. Now my hand dryer project got picked up by the Daily Mail as well. So I had my moment in the Daily Mail, which was kind of interesting. It's always interesting to have those moments of fame. What was annoying, this is the online version, they had a picture of a Dyson, I think, on the website, and I never mentioned brands when some of the work. But anyway, the editor just shoved a Dyson, and I think they got scared and took it down halfway through the day on the website because maybe Dyson had complained. And then the editor wrote, you can't read that, but what it says is, dry in seconds, but as noisy as a road drill. And the road drill refers to, I'll show you in a minute, but road drill is looking at the acoustic numbers. That's a way of communicating it. Super fast hand dryers may be loud enough to damage people's hearing. I never said that. Okay, I never said anything about hand dryers damaging people's hearing. Okay, that's an editorial comment. I never said that. But there it is in the Daily Mail with millions of people reading this, and then I got comments, and some people are saying this research is rubbish because everyone knows damage your hearing. You have to be exposed to 40 hours a week at 80 decibels. And it's like, I know that, I didn't say that. So that was annoying, and I couldn't do anything about it. It's one of the things you can't stop. And then Huffington Post the next day or next week said, did you know hand dryers can damage your hearing? Well, John Drever said they can damage your hearing. I never said that. So that's annoying, but it's for me, that's an important point that that's not the only, damaging your hearing is not the only issue. There's many, many more important issues around loudness than getting your hearing damaged. That's just one of them. Okay, so that's why I have that kind of slide in there. So where do we get these ideas from? So this is what we teach at school. We teach that the threshold of hearing is 0 decibels, refers to a particular as Pascal, and it goes up to the threshold of pain, which is 130 to 140. This is something that actually Jonathan Stern's been looking into, the history of pain and sound, which is really crazy. It's really like wild stuff that's really, where they get the idea that 130 is the threshold of pain is really ridiculous. We get told, I repeat these things, we tell students, our perception of hearing is from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. That's what we teach, Where do we get that? Who says that? Who is this person who got 20 hertz? Is it more than that? Is it less than that? Etc. The ear canal is regarded as a standard shape and size and width and so on. But that's an adult. If a particular adult's got that ear canal, what kids have got different? They've just got different. What does the ear canal do? The ear canal is a tube that resonates at particular frequencies. If it's a tiny ear canal, it's going to resonate at much higher frequencies. It's like tiny, like a little piccolo instead of a big flute. They're different instruments. You can't just say all ear canals are the same. It makes a difference. Also, a presumption is that hearing is a, spatial perception is like a continuum, and we have the symmetrical spatial hearing. That's why we have stereo sound is predicated on symmetrical hearing. Who's got symmetrical hearing? I don't know. I've got particular hearing loss in my right ear, which is my tinnitus ear, and I got really cool headphones now that I can compensate for that now, so I can get my symmetrical hearing back with my cool headphones. But you know, who's got the symmetrical hearing? I mean, when you answer the phone, do you have a tendency to use a specific ear? I think we all do, don't we? Why? Is that because you're left or right-handed, or is it something odd, or is it an auditory issue? I don't answer it, but anyway. And these graphs on the side are important. Okay, so this is the equal loudness thing is probably the most important thing in all of this. So the equal loudness contour is basically how you hear different frequencies. This is where A-weighted decibels comes from. To get equal loudness contours, you basically go into an anechoic. You have someone outside. Someone's in an anechoic chamber. They put some headphones on. So in the silent space, they get played a frequency at say 100 hertz, and then they hear the frequency at an octave lower, and they get the person outside who's making the tones to adjust it so they hear them as equally loud. And they're happy, they're equally loud. And then they get another frequency, and they adjust them so they're equally loud. And because you go through the whole kind of spectrum, and you start charting out someone's hearing to get that pattern of someone's hearing. And so that's where you get this thing from. So this is my very rough version of it, but that's where you get that from. And that is now, A-weighted decibels accounts for how we hear loudness referring to different frequencies. Is that clear? You know, clearly, and it peters out at high and low frequencies. And you've got this little peak there to do a kind of speech, where speech kind of generally sits. Now to get this study, you have to be between the ages of 18 and 25. That's where the standard comes from, and you have to basically have good hearing. So basically a perfect young person. So otologically normal. It's a cool term, otologically normal, which I find this in the standard, and I use it all the time because this thing's a weird term. But this is otologically normal person, where basically all acoustics is predicated on, yeah, and that's really, really important, because who is this otologically normal person? It's not, maybe in the room, but it's not me. I may have had it once, maybe for a few moments of my life I was that person. So it's not quite the order, but so we had this kind of list off, because these are all kind of A-weighted decibels. So this is the otologically person, this is how they perceive different things. This is very old now, actually, so when you're talking about a road drill, this is actually a road drill from the 1970s, so I'm not quite sure what it would be now. But this stuff, okay, again, this is the kind of thing that gets reproduced, although it's like, here's the list of loudness and decibels, but it's like some ancient, a washing machine from the 1950s probably, but anyway, but we use these things all the time, but who is this person? I don't know. Anyway, and it's logarithmic as well. You've got to remember decibels is logarithmic, so there's a difference between them. It's not linear. Okay, I'm going to speed through a few more things now. The other important thing is the concept weird research. Yeah, so it's an important thing if you don't know about it. So, and this is particularly looking at psychology here. But basically, if you're doing a PhD in psychology and doing some experiments, who is your sample? Normally. Pardon? Students. It's other PhD students. So, and who are the other PhD students? Kind of youngish, Western. What does it stand for? Does anyone know this? What does it stand for? Western, educated. It's probably my slide there somewhere. Actually, Mattia Kobianki made this slide. He was a PhD student of mine. But it's a particularly strange, the term weird is quite nice because it's a very specific subset. And they stand in for the whole of society. And that's all our psychology models, pretty much. Is that right? This shows actually how many of those psychological studies uses these subgroups. This is a particular English thing, but maybe you've got a version in Sweden or Denmark. We've got this idea of the man on the Clapham omnibus. And this works in English law. It comes from the Victorian age, but you need to find out how, basically, the person that we make law around is the man in the Clapham omnibus. It's like the standard, did you have a term for this? Like the everyday person, the normal person. But that's a very specific person, the man in the Clapham omnibus. He's a kind of person, he's a man who commutes. He's not disabled, he's not impaired. But again, we have these strange kind of conventions about normativity. Okay, so there's all these things. So aural-typical hearing, and I've totally taken this from neurotypical. I've just swapped the words. Aural-typical people tend to impose their understanding of normal hearing on everyone else as correct and natural. we do that. We do that all the time. In my office, I've got hundreds and hundreds of books on sound studies. They're all aural-typical. Hearing is given. I've got a few books on different kinds of hearing impairment, but they're written in an aural-typical way because hearing impairments like diverges from the norm. So all my books on sound are aural-typical. So that makes sense. So aural diverse or an aural divergent. So accompanying aural-typical hearing, which we are trained to practice as acousticians, is the actual variety of hearing they're experienced throughout our normal day and throughout our lives, albeit to varying degrees. From the trifling experience of a temporary threshold shift, so just from a bit of noise in the street, it changes, or to transient ear noise, or to intolerable pain from hyperacusis. We can call this aural diversity. And it's really normal. The term is it can be extreme. You could be profound hearing loss or hyperacusis, or just as I was traveling over there on the flight, my ears were popping. And I popped my ears and then suddenly, my perception had changed. Or you have a head cold, or you have a migraine. When you have a migraine, what does your hearing do? It's just like really more intense. Everything's louder. So it's all these things. It's kind of hearing is really unreliable. In music, we've got this. I'll probably run out of time now, but in music we compose for this aural, even more than aural-typical, this kind of idealized, perfect listener. And the classic thing is Milton Babbitt. He talks about this kind of. I know he wrote this in the kind of late 50s, and it's a very provocative article, and it's really kind of ridiculous. But he talks about the suitably equipped receiver to listen to his music. That receiver has to be able to have a great aural perception. It's not just about understanding the musical language. It's about really focusing on the kind of being very attentive, not sneezing, not having any buzzes or having a hangover or whatever. It's like this kind of wonderful hearer who knows the musical. It's very specific. It's like a modernist kind of paradigm for hearing. Interesting, when he wrote it, that 1958, he was already in his 50s, I think, or something. He was way past this otologically normal stage. I was at a concert recently. A few years ago with, it was a great concert, and it presented a whole amazing group of great vintage British acousmatic electroacoustic composers. And they were wonderful and they're fantastic. And they all played pieces they composed in the 1970s with lots of high frequency content. For me, it was like, super too loud. And in acousmatic music, actually my next slide, you've got Pierre Schaeffer, who talks about primacy of the ear, doing a kind of phonological approach. The hearing is like absolutely central. It's the potential for development along with the boundaries of any music depends on our capacity for hearing. It's all about hearing. So that's the problem, though. If you compose a piece as a young 20-year-old and you come back to it when you're in your 70s, it's based on the kind of Dennis Smalley's spectromorphological approach to composition. Is it the same piece? And how can there's a problem here. It's not the same music. And if you're making spectral composition, who are you composing for? Here's Murray Schaeffer talking about clairaudience. He says that we've got to train people. It's a good idea, of course, train people to become sound designers. But he kind of talks about this idea of clairaudience. You can have this better kind of hearing, but through doing sound walks. But how can you have this better hearing? So we've been doing this stuff, and I've been particularly working with Andrew Hugo, who's actually has very complex hearing. He's a composer who has diploacusis, so he hears pitches differently than our typical people. Imagine being a composer and you can't hear the same pitch, or you hear a combination of pitches instead of one pitch. And he's also got, because remember with the hearing, you've also got your semicircular canals, you've got your balance organ also sitting in the same organ in your ear. And so he's got his huge balance issues as well. And actually, if I'm correct in saying, I think he's had his the vestibular nerve cut as well now. So, but through aural diversity, he's come back to composition because we all hear differently. And we've been having these concerts where all the performers, all the composers, and the audience can be aural diverse. It's complex, and we're kind of working on it. It's kind of work in progress. But what we mustn't do is, so I'm just going to jump through here, but we we're at an interesting stage in our culture where I think we're really interested in hearing and soundness now. I mean, here's a few, you probably watch Sound of Metal, A Quiet Place. Quiet Place is all about different kinds. A Quiet Place is like an aural diverse kind of film. But, or even The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, maybe it's a better example. Have you read the book, Diving Bell and the Butterfly? So in the book works in a much more aural diverse way and much better because he actually explains that he's only got hearing in one ear and only a bit of hearing in that one ear. In the film, you can't do that. You can't have a kind of Hollywood movie with just a kind of one broken speaker working, Or can you? Maybe that's a bit more, but so it's kind of done it's still kind of Hollywood sound design, but kind of representing his kind of sensory experience. Or you get, the quite curious incident of the dog in the night. I mean, I took my kids to that in London, and it's about a young autistic boy, and he kind of has moments of kind of shutdown. And it's a very complex, noisy performance. I think if you took an autistic, and in fact, I think they have done quiet versions of it for an autistic audience, but I still wouldn't really recommend it for. Or Baby Driver. Baby Driver for me is the worst. So Baby Driver, it's about he's got tinnitus, the main chap, and it's written into the score. And I think it's a cool film. I love it. But as someone with tinnitus, it's like it takes me weeks for my tinnitus to come down again after watching that film because it's like massive high frequency. And you get this in the BBC all the time. For example, everyone's obsessed with misophonia in the BBC. So you'll suddenly get a news report saying, do these sounds upset you? And then they'll play you lots of crisps and lots of mouth sounds, and then they'll explain there's something called misophonia, and we need to be thinking about these people. It's like, oh, hang on, you bastards! If you had misophonia, you've just done a nasty thing to those people. Why would you? It's like so they're talking to a kind of. It's this aural so it's shifting from an aural typical mindset to an aural diverse mindset. That's the kind of goal, right? I think I'm done now, almost. This is our book. That's a break. That's a really interesting book. Interesting enough, we barely talk about terms like impairment or disability. That's not really from choice. That's kind of how it kind of evolved. I know Jonathan Stern is, in his most recent book, it really kind of sets us up, impairment, disability. But we kind of, for whatever reason, we haven't really kind of. It's a kind of subset. Someone was questioning me, well, John, what about disability? Because clearly that's important. You need to be defined as being disabled to get funding, and people have been fought to be recognised as being disabled, and I totally appreciate that. But I think disabled is kind of a subset of aural diversity, I think. We're working it out. I don't know, it's kind of open to anyone to kind of have a take on it. And the book's really interesting. There's quite a lot of autism in here, autistic hearing. But it's important. So Bill, where is he? The chapter by Bill there. Can't see it now. Yeah, well, he's called William Davis. Okay, Bill Davis. He's a very important acoustician in Britain who's really developed soundscape work, and he's recently, I'm not quite sure what he is, but he's a kind of older academic. He's recently been recognised as having autism, and he actually sees that, but I hear in an autistic way, and that's why I've become a really top acoustician and soundscape person, because I'm able to decompose the soundscape in a way that normal people can't. It's an advantage in my field. This is, Andrew Hugel's made this kind of sketch of aural diversity, which I've kind of covered all of these issues, but I haven't represented it like that. And it's an interesting way of looking at it. I don't think I would have done that personally. It's kind of, and I guess most of us have got some of these, or all of some of these that kind of connect. So that's, you can find this on our website. Here's my final slide. There you go. Things are happening in the UK. So we got, earmuffs are, ear defenders, protecting younger ears and ears. This is just from yesterday, actually, from Manchester. Who knows the football? Is that Manchester City or something? I'm going to get in trouble now. But anyway, here's this kind of top footballer coming out with a young boy, kind of mascot, and he's supporting him wearing his ear defenders as well. So suddenly, but I think the future King of England here, with earmuffs, is quite interesting with the kind of royal blue colour is quite interesting because it's, again, I use that at an aircraft exhibition. But actually, but sadly, there was a moment, it was in all newspapers at what was some event recently? Was it the Queen dying? And it was some event, and you saw, who is he, Prince George or something? Anyway, he's like, there's some big moment, there's like some flights, he wasn't wearing his earmuffs, and there's these planes coming on, and he was obviously had his hands over his ears, and he was like really upset. And everyone thought, oh, that's really cute. And it was in the headlines of news, oh, it's so cute. It's not cute, give him back his head muffs. Anyway, I'll stop now, but I'm not quite sure how long I'm going to talk for, but there's all these, lots of things pulling in this kind of subject, which is quite interesting, and it's going somewhere. But I think we're at a kind of, I think we're at a moment of kind of sensitization, a kind of hearing sensitization moment, which is interesting. We're becoming more sensitive to sound on the whole. And that's problematic as well. And especially for us kind of soundscape people who are kind of take people on sound walks and we're kind of getting people to listen better and more aware of the soundscape. But if that soundscape's really noisy, that has a kind of ethical issue you kind of have to deal with, which is a bit complex. What do you... and there's some evidence about the sensitization thing. Aircraft noise has objectively become quieter in the UK over the last 10 years. But the annoyance curves, which are done through social surveys, say that people are much more annoyed by air transport now than they used to be. So it's getting quieter, but the annoyance is going up. Our perception of them being loud is basically getting higher whilst they get quieter. So it's quite interesting kind of where we're going with this as a society. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.